Welcome to the Innovation Race podcast, where we meet fascinating inventors, innovators, politicians, and leaders who share the view that what's best for our country is to protect patents and keep innovation in America. Now, here's your host, Jenny Beth Martin.
Gordon Chang is one of America's leading voices on the topic of China. He's an author, a columnist, and an attorney. After Gordon got his law degree from Cornell, he lived in mainland China and Hong Kong for 2 decades, working as a partner and counsel for 2 American international law firms. He's given briefings to the National Intelligence Council, the CIA, the U.S. State Department, and the U.S. Department of Defense. He's testified before Congress, and he's a frequent guest on nearly every TV news network. Gordon brings great insight into our documentary film, Innovation Race, which, if you haven't seen it yet, Innovation Race will be available on the SalemNOW platform. And now I'm excited to share with you my conversation with Gordon Chang. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jenny Beth.
Tell us a little bit about your background so that people understand what has made you one of the leading voices in our country on the topic of China.
Well, I don't know about a leading voice, but I can tell you about my background. I practiced law for 25 years, primarily in New York, Hong Kong, and in Southern California. And for the last 5 years in Shanghai, between August 1996 and 2000. And after that, I wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. And since then, I've been writing about China and North Korea and the region.
And what did you cover in that first book that made you continue to write and focus so much on China?
When we arrived in China, it was a time of great optimism. And I can remember as soon as we got into our apartment, Lydia, my wife, got on the phone and said, "Mom, China's not communist anymore." And I agreed with her. This was really a very, very sort of interesting time in China. It was opening up. Everyone was optimistic about the direction of the country. My clients would buzz into Shanghai, stay at the Grand Hyatt, which is really one of the most spectacular hotels in the world, and they'd say, "China's not communist anymore." But as we lived in China, we worked there, we traveled around, we spoke to people, it became clear that China was communist and that this brief opening period wasn't going to last for very long. And so I felt that the system was not sustainable. So I wrote a book, The Coming Collapse of China. It was released in 2001. And I said, well, the Communist Party is going to fall in a decade. So what I didn't foresee in my defense is the 2008 downturn, which had a number of important implications, not only for the Chinese regime, but of course for the rest of the world. And so that gave the Communist Party a new lease on life. But what we're seeing right now, Jenny Beth, is China having its 2008. Remember, you go back to 2008, we're more or less a free market economy. And we allowed the recession to undo a lot of the excesses of the boom period. Well, China didn't want to permit that. They said, no, we're not having a recession, a downturn. So they went and embarked on a stimulus program, which perhaps is the biggest in history. Because just think about this. From 2009 and the following 4 years, they created an amount of credit in their banking system that was equal to the amount of credit in our banking system, wow. Even though in 2008, China's economy was less than a third the size of ours. So yeah, they avoided 2008, but right now their economy is exhausted. And so they're having that downturn right now. And I don't think there's very much they can do. They can maybe defer it a year or two, but they're going to have like one of history's biggest financial crises.
And what do you think that potential does to America and the world, our economy, and then just national security as well?
Well, I think that it certainly will throw the financial markets into a panic. But they'll throw them into a panic because we overestimate China's importance to the world. I mean, you've heard countless smart people say, oh, China's an engine of global growth. Well, no, it isn't. Yeah, China's had a lot of growth, but it's not an engine of global growth. Because to be an engine of global growth, you've got to buy the goods and services of other countries to create growth elsewhere. And China, through predatory and sometimes criminal trade practices, takes growth from other countries. So if we weren't going to panic, well, China would disappear and we'd all be much better. So, but of course, there is the panic factor because people don't understand China's unimportance to the system. And so, yeah, there will be a time. And remember, we're at a time when Europe is in real financial trouble. You know, you're seeing rumors about two big banks, Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse, could possibly go under. They probably won't because they'll be rescued, but that's going to create problems. And of course, the U.S. is in recession. The rest of the world looks pretty awful. You know, you have famine because of the war in Ukraine. You got failed societies like Sri Lanka. Pakistan is going to be the next big disaster. So it is happening in the context where the world is falling apart. And that really makes this very different in a sense. But ultimately, China's disappearance from the top ranks will actually be good for everybody.
You understand international affairs and national security better than I do. So as you're looking at all these different points in the world, like the Swiss bank and other places, and the fact that we're in a recession, and then you look at what's happening in Ukraine as well, what are you concerned about? The stability, not just of economies, but of national security and military threats.
Yeah. Well, you know, I should start out by saying nobody understands what's going on right now. So we're all at the same point because there are too many moving parts and too many consequential things are happening. And so right now, you know, everyone's pretty much, everyone's opinions is equally good.
Right.
I tend to think, though, that as the international system disintegrates, as China and Russia attack it, anything can happen.
Yeah.
So we have to be prepared for worst outcomes. You know, we had President Biden just a day or so ago said, oh, you know, this looks like the worst time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. He actually used the word Armageddon, and a lot of people criticize him for it, but I actually think it's right. And actually, I think he's wrong in one important respect, in that this is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, more dangerous than the Checkpoint Charlie crisis of the preceding year, 61 and 62. And the reason is we know from the archives that neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy was willing to use nuclear weapons. We don't know that about Vladimir Putin. We don't know that about Xi Jinping. We don't know that about Kim Jong-un and who's ever in charge in Iran these days. So I think this is actually more dangerous. And in addition, there are other reasons, you know, the global economic and financial crises that are just down the road, famine crises, that really puts this into a very different context than 61 and 62.
Right. It's weird to hear things about famine crises when most of my life it's never
take everything for granted.
Food shortages are, not something that we've ever really experienced. And I went through a period in my life where I went through financial crisis, so I know what it's like to worry about putting food on the table for your children, but not because there was no food around. So there are a lot of things that we have taken for granted, that the disruptions in the last 2 years to the supply chain have just created all sorts of problems that I think we're still going to be living out for several more years.
Yeah. What's happening right now is beyond the imagination of many Americans. I mean, there are some people who remember the 1930s, some people who remember World War II, but very few of them. You know, we've had generations that have had no sense of scarcity. And we've got that right now because not only do you have problems, you know, you've got the problems with Ukraine and Russia, stuff not coming out of the Black Sea. They've got an agreement, but, you know, who knows whether that will hold up or not. But and then you also have drought. You have drought in China, which always has had food shortages, and now those are worsening. But in the United States, like the breadbasket of the world, the drought in the West is the worst in 1,200 years. You know, Lydia and I, my wife, we were just driving through Missouri last week, and we saw the corn was rusted. I mean, it should be green. It was actually yellow. And that's because of a number of reasons, including the scarcity of water. So this is unprecedented, certainly unprecedented for people who are now living.
When we look at the film that you are in, that we've produced, Innovation Race, one of the things that we talk about is the potential threat that Taiwan faces from China. What do you think about the China-Taiwan relationship?
Well, there's so much going on there. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, I think is creating a crisis because for a number of reasons, many of them just internal. China right now is facing a lot of internal shocks. It's got a contracting economy, a plunging currency, the property market, which is really important for the middle-class Chinese, that's falling apart. Worsening food shortages, which we just talked about. The environment is just completely broken. And these COVID-19 outbreaks, which the regime can't control. And so I think, and Xi Jinping is known to be the author of domestic policies, and these are disasters that he's responsible for. Well, I mean, just a very simple, Geopolitics 101 says, well, why doesn't he start a crisis elsewhere to divert the Chinese people from what's going on at home? I'm not saying he would do that, but I'm saying he has the incentive to do that. And then when you put that all aside, there's something else which is facing China. Remember, Xi Jinping's idea of diplomacy is to intimidate everybody. And if you're the world's most populous state, yeah, you can intimidate people. But China is facing the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. You got a country that they claim 1.41 billion people. But it's not going to be 1.41 billion people for long. So, for instance, 2 Chinese demographers last year said, we're probably going to lose half our population in 45 years. You do the extrapolate from their total fertility rate, and you're talking about a country at the end of this century that maybe, if they're lucky, will have 500 million people. In other words, it's going to be less populous than Pakistan. It's going to be less populous probably than Indonesia. Who knows? All these countries are going to be have more people. And if you're Xi Jinping, how can you intimidate if you have a country which is falling apart? So that really puts a closing window of opportunity on China. And that means it's not just Taiwan, it's India, Japan, the Philippines, all these countries to the south and to the east of China. They're all at risk. And then, of course, everybody else is at risk because China is trying to close off the global commons. So we've seen some very dangerous intercepts of ships and planes in the last couple months. So, it could be Taiwan, but it can be any place else. But China right now has a lot of incentive to lash out. We also know, just apart from what the incentives are and what we can speculate, we know they are in fact lashing out. And that means whatever the reason, this is an incredibly dangerous country right now.
And when you say, elaborate on that just a little bit. I know you just said from some of the intercepts, but elaborate on how we know they are in fact lashing out.
Well, I'll just give you an example. May 26th of this year, a Royal Australian Air Force P-8, it's a reconnaissance plane, was in international airspace in the South China Sea. The Chinese Air Force did something which has never been done before to everyone's knowledge, and that is there was an intercept of the Australian plane. That happens all the time. But the Chinese then fired flares and chaff. Chaff is sort of like the aluminum foil, which is used to confuse radar. But they fired at that in the proximity of the Australian plane. Some of the chaff was actually ingested into one of the P-8's 2 engines. So the crew is very lucky to get back to base. This is something which extremely provocative and is unprecedented. So we're seeing that. And if you go through the litany of China's dangerous intercepts, you can go back years. So, but now they're becoming more acute and certainly more provocative. So I think that what we can say is that China is lashing out. I can speculate as to motive, as I just did, but whatever it is, whatever the motive is, they've become an incredibly dangerous regime.
Just so much of our life in America right now is dependent on China. Do you think that the businesses we need to be bringing more business and manufacturing out of China, potentially to America or other parts of the world? What would you recommend to businesses right now?
Well, absolutely. This is not so much, business will do whatever is legal, and it's legal to be there, but it's up to the President of the United States to define the national security goals of the U.S. and to implement them. And that's up to President Biden to do. And if I were President of the United States, I would be ordering businesses out of China. And the reason, and I know that sounds drastic, but remember, China has been using every point of contact to overwhelm and take down our society. And we are just completely not able to deal with this. Our FBI is overwhelmed, local law enforcement's overwhelmed, governments are overwhelmed, NGOs are overwhelmed, you name it. So until we can get a handle on this, we need to sever those contacts with China. And that means to the extent we can, like cutting out trade, making sure we get our businesses back, putting a time limit on how long it's legal to be there, no investment into China. And I would close the 4 Chinese consulates in the U.S., I would strip that embassy staff, that cast of thousands, down to the ambassador and his security guard. He could have a secretary if he likes, but it's down to a dozen. And we need to take the state banks out of our country. Those state banks are laundering money. We didn't allow Pablo Escobar to launder money through our banking system. We're allowing the Chinese to do it. But there's so many things that we should be doing, and we should be doing them now because this is urgent. And yes, I know that most people would think that that is not possible, but we got into this situation. You go back 40 years, people would have never imagined that what is seen today is possible. So we can obviously take it down.
One thing that always concerns me now in light of what we've watched unfold over the last few years is that when you just mentioned they cannot get control of COVID, sometimes in the back of my mind, I wonder if they just want to be able to disrupt the supply chain around the world, because they know that if they're not manufacturing anything right now and things are not being exported from China and imported to other countries, we may not feel that right away, but we'll feel that in 2 months when the product should have been on our shelves. And I have no idea if they're doing that or not, but it just seems to me like when you say he has incentives to cause problems in other parts of the world, that is a place where it may not make people die, it may not ruin everything, but it's disruptive and it focuses attention elsewhere.
If COVID-19 didn't start out as a biological weapon, the Chinese turned it into one. I mean, the source of SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen behind this disease, subject to a lot of debate. But I think that when you start looking at the preponderance of evidence, that it was manufactured in a lab. But put that aside for a moment. We know whatever the source of this pathogen, China turned it into a biological weapon. They did that 2 ways. First of all, they knew this was a highly contagious disease, but they told the world for weeks that it was not. And then while they were locking down their own country, and of course lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down their own country, they were telling everybody they thought that was an effective way of stopping the disease. So while they were locking down their own country, they were pressuring other countries to take arrivals from China without travel restrictions or quarantines. So you put those 2 things together, lying about contagiousness and forcing people out of China into the rest of the world, that's murder. That's 6.5 million people who have died from this disease outside China. Those are murders. We're talking about 1,060,000 or so Americans. Each one of those Americans, I believe, should be considered a murder. China could have stopped this. They didn't. My speculation is that Xi Jinping, once he saw this disease out in Chinese society, he decided that he was going to level the playing field. Got to remember the Chinese have borrowed the Soviet concept of comprehensive national power. And China always wants to have the highest CNP ranking. In other words, the most powerful country. Well, there's 2 ways to get to that. Either you strengthen yourself, no problem with that, or you weaken everybody else. And what China did was, once I saw that this disease was there, I think Xi Jinping said, I'm going to spread the misery. And so really what we should be considering is China murdered these people. And so therefore, that puts relations with China in a very different light.
And I think there are some Americans who are looking at China that way and others who are not, and maybe others who want to look at them this way, the way you describe, but maybe aren't just they want
Facts
to, but they're
are
not ready
facts.
to do it. They can't actually go there. They're worried. Maybe their business is interdependent on the Chinese economy. I'm not sure for what all reasons, but it's very alarming to me.
Well, it's the president of the United States is not defending the American people. Remember, Biden's had, 5, 6 conversations now with Xi Jinping. He has yet to raise the issue of the origins of COVID-19. And COVID-19 is not the only way that China's been killing Americans. We got a fentanyl crisis.
Right.
We had last year, pick your number, but it's about 77,000 Americans died from overdoses of illegal fentanyl. That fentanyl came from China. And, these are criminal gangs. And we've had a number of presidents, not just Biden, sort of give China free passes on this. But we've got to remember, the Communist Party runs a near total surveillance state. These fentanyl gangs are large, they're well organized, they're international. They use the Chinese postal system to send fentanyl to the U.S. When that avenue is closed off, they use containers. China examines every container before it leaves China. And the fentanyl gangs, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. So the Communist Party is a co-conspirator. Those 77,000 Americans who died last year from fentanyl, each one of those is a murderer as well. That should put our relations with China in a very different light. And I can understand somebody on Wall Street saying, well, I'm going to do business with these guys. It's legal. Okay, but if you're the president of the United States, you have the power to make those business dealings illegal by using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, or what I would use, which is the Trading with the Enemy Act of the 1917. We can stop this. It's up to the President of the United States, who has utterly failed to discharge his number one constitutional duty, which is to protect the American people from foreign attack.
You have a book with Frank Gaffney, I believe, and Frank's premise is that China already sees itself at war with us, whether we see that or not. Is that what you think as well?
Yeah, I think I wrote an introduction for a book that Frank edited. We don't have to speculate. May 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote-unquote people's war on America. You can't get any clearer than that. Now, people talk about unrestricted warfare, the title of that 1999 book by then 2 Chinese Air Force colonels who got promoted, by the way. And I think that is indeed their doctrine. But whatever it is, we know that a people's war has been declared. And we Americans are oblivious. We're Americans. We think that we don't have to pay attention to what our enemies say. And on one day, 9/11, we lost almost 3,000 Americans because we couldn't be bothered to deal with Osama bin Laden, who was saying that I want to kill Americans.
Right.
So, Osama bin Laden, as powerful as he was, is not nearly as able to accomplish horrendous aims as the Chinese state.
In the documentary that we've done, Innovation Race, we talk a lot about intellectual property and patents. And part of the documentary, we highlight that more people right now are patenting, getting inventions and ideas patented in China than they are in America. And that's just switched over the last couple of years. And it's possible that it switches back and forth. I'm not exactly sure, but I always think this. I think that that people who are going, if they're from America and they're going there to patent, they are going there with a false sense of security, because I don't think that China actually respects property rights at all. Certainly not the way that we would traditionally think of that. And the same goes for basic human rights.
Yeah, I mean, there's no law in China as a practical matter. This is a communist state. In a communist state, it is the will of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party represents, law is unimportant, represents the forces of history. And it cannot be bound by laws. So there's no rule of law in China. It is the will of the Communist Party. So, yeah, they do not protect property rights. And they have not, and they never will, as long as China is ruled by the Communist Party of China.
What I think is that the people who maybe are going there and doing that, it's sort of like when you first went to China and you're like, oh, it's not a communist country. And it seemed that way. But then I just it's very important, regardless of whether you can trust China or not, that we strengthen our patent system again so that people want to patent here in America, and we are spurring more innovation so we can compete with China.
Yeah, well, both the Obama and Biden administrations have tried to weaken American patent protection. And this is just, forget about China for the moment. This is our issue. And obviously we needed to strengthen patents to give inventors the incentive. So that's important for us to do. Now, this is a domestic fight in the United States, but we have to, this is one where we need to win to protect America's ability to innovate.
If they continue to be a leader in innovation and become the world leader, what do you think that does to the way their power structure is and the dynamics in the world?
Well, it's clear, this is just true of any society. If a society can innovate, it will have the strongest economy. If it has the strongest economy, it can have the strongest military. It'll have the most vibrant society. It's just a very simple equation.
So that then just comes right back to the fact that we have to improve this in America.
Well, we have to stop the Chinese from stealing our stuff. I mean, that's one thing. And we have to recognize the maliciousness of China's tactics. Just take DNA profiles. You want to find the largest collection of DNA profiles of Americans? It's not in America. It's in China. China has been hoovering up all the world's DNA because I believe it is developing weapons that are basically targeted. They call them specific ethnic genetic attacks. They've been writing about this for about 5 years or more in public, which is basically developing pathogens that will leave the Chinese immune and sicken and kill everybody else. So, the ominous thing here is that China prevents the transfer of DNA profiles of Chinese people out of China. Well, okay. But then why are we allowing the transfer of DNA profiles of Americans to China? There has to be reciprocity here.
There certainly is not reciprocity. They seem to want other companies and other countries to give to them, or they take from them in order to do business there. And what you get in return is a short-term financial benefit from doing business in China. But it may weaken your country as a whole, and people just don't look at the side effects of the unintended side effects of some of their actions.
Well, we've had decades of China's theft of U.S. intellectual property, so there's really no excuse. I mean, and it's not just the owners of patents, it's our political class.
What do you think is the reason why people just ignore the decades of history?
That's a great question because, part of it is just individual greed, the thinking that, well, as you say, I can make money. But a part of it is also there's been this sense, especially after the end of the Cold War, that the United States could integrate China into the international system. And so therefore, it's been the policy of American presidents to actually strengthen the Communist Party of China. Now, I think by now we should realize that policy was naive. Certainly, it's not worked out that way because as the party has become stronger, it's not become benign as we all had expected. It has actually become more provocative and more belligerent, and certainly much more dangerous, more ambitious. So there needs to be, an end to this whole notion of engagement. We have to understand that the Communist Party views the United States as an existential threat. And it's not because of any policies that we have, it's because who we are. Because we have human rights, because we have democracy. And the Communist Party, which is insecure even at the best of times, and even more so now, they are worried about how attractive this is to the Chinese people. So because we're a democracy, we're an existential threat. And that means this is a zero-sum game. That means there cannot be coexistence. It's either the People's Republic of China or the United States of America will survive, but not both.
And it has to be America.
Absolutely.
I think that one of the things that I have seen that actually someone who used to be in Congress, who's no longer there, pointed out to me that for the last 250 years, it has either been Great Britain or America holding up liberty in the world. And people may argue with the way that either country has done it over time, but by and large, we have respected human rights and gotten better at respecting human rights over time. But we're the ones that the world has looked to. And since World War II, it's been America holding that up. And when you think, oh, well, I could just leave America and go somewhere else, and if you're frustrated with America, well, you can only leave America and go somewhere else and be an expat as long as America still exists to protect the rest of the world. Do you agree with that, with what I'm saying with that?
Someone should mention that to Brittany Griner. Yeah, of course. I mean, the international system is held together by American power. And when you have an administration like the present one who doesn't believe in that's the reason why the world is falling apart. And that's the reason why Biden was right. Yeah, possibility of Armageddon.
That's a very scary possibility. The possibility of another world war or a war actually being fought in America, something we've never even imagined. Or all of the different scenarios that you laid out. We've lived in a time in this country. I'm 52. We've lived in a time for the last 50 years where we have been at war, but I think that some of what we're looking at in the fairly near future is very, very alarming.
Well, Vladimir Putin threatens to use his nuclear weapons, and he's threatened not just the use of tactical, theater, low-yield weapons, but also his strategic weapons, his intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Chinese have threatened first strikes with their nukes. So Kim Jong-un did so a few months ago. So yeah, the world looks exceedingly dangerous.
And for people who maybe grew up just a little bit younger than me, even just 10 years younger than me, they probably don't remember the Cold War the way that you and I do. And can you elaborate on some of what the threats are when they're talking about using these intercontinental ballistic missiles?
Well, when you put all the world's warheads together, basically that's extinction of humanity if they were all used. But it's not just nuclear weapons; it's chemical and, as we've seen, biological weapons. And so you have all of these weapons of mass destruction, which can end humanity. And really, that's what's at stake right now. It's whether the human race survives.
And the difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis and what it seems right now is that America and the Soviet Union were threatening to use the weapons, but never really intended to use the weapons.
Well, the archives, Khrushchev and Kennedy, very clear, neither was willing to use their most destructive weapons in the arsenal. So there was a lot of, we outside didn't know that at the time, but and certainly Kennedy didn't know what Khrushchev was thinking, and vice versa. But the point is, as we look back, it was not as dangerous as it appeared. Right now, we don't know what Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping will do.
And we don't know what they will do. And then throughout the Cold War, and especially in the Ronald Reagan years, it was peace through strength, which means we showed the world we were willing to use them if we had to. And I don't know that anyone around the world right now has the same kind of confidence in this administration.
Well, just go back to what Reagan did. Reagan, his primary tactic in ending the Soviet Union wasn't military. People say, oh, he built up the U.S. military. The Soviets realized they couldn't catch up, so the Soviets surrendered. Well, no, what happened, that did happen. But that was not the important thing. The important thing was that Reagan decided to basically starve the Soviet beast. What he did was he went on a campaign to lower commodity prices. And it was not just in the United States drilling. He went to the Saudis, he went to everybody else to just drill or to dig or whatever. And Soviets couldn't keep up. They just weren't getting money. What do we have today? We have a policy which is not to drill, which is actually enriching Putin, which is enabling him to continue his warlike aims. And so it's really the opposite of the Cold War. We have really gotten stupid as Americans. And And I think part of it is because we don't realize how dangerous this is. And so we are not taking those measures that we could take. But, the world's very different. Reagan went to the Saudis and said, drill. And the Saudis said yes. What happened a couple days ago? The Saudis decided that they were going to work through OPEC to cut output, thereby raising the price of hydrocarbons, thereby enriching Vladimir Putin. And that means that Biden realizes he's got to go to Venezuela to plead for oil.
Communist country. It doesn't even make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. If you talk to KT McFarland, who was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump years, she said that in the beginning, Trump's idea was to actually drill. This would lower the cost for U.S. manufacturers. Plus, it would also give the U.S. the ability to sell oil and gas around the world, which would give us leverage. So what has Biden done? Biden's done the exact opposite of that. This is just horrible policy. He
could open drilling again here in America right now, and he still hasn't done that. It's a little mind-boggling.
He worries about climate change. Okay, I get it. But the point is, if you're worried about climate change and you've decided to buy more oil, if you buy oil from another country, you've got to transport oil here, which means you're putting a lot of carbon in the air just to get oil and gas into the U.S. So if you're worried about climate change, you should drill here if you believe that we need more oil and gas, because you do that with the less effect on the environment. The Biden policy is just straight out stupid.
So let's move back over into innovation race and patents and a little bit away from banging on the Biden administration. They are what they are, but we're just trying to look at the world as a whole. In our documentary, one of the things at the very beginning of the documentary, we try to set the stage. I think we do it successfully, of what happened in the past between America and the Soviet Union during the space race, and compare what's happening right now with America and China in the innovation race, is what we call it. And you in the film talk a lot about that space race, and you wind up being a voice that narrates this part of the film. What do you remember from the space race and what Kennedy did, and then ultimately man landing on the moon, American man landing on the moon?
Yeah, the Soviets were ahead of I can remember my dad taking me out in the backyard and looking at Sputnik as it crossed the sky. And the Soviets were ahead. I mean, they put the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. But John Kennedy went to Rice University and he said, we're getting there first. And that's exactly what happened. Because it was determination on the part of the President of the United States to get to the moon first. Right now, and this is banging on Biden, but it's also banging on Trump and banging on Obama and banging on Bush. They really have not seen space as a priority, and certainly not human exploration of space. But thank God this is the United States of America, and we got someone named Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And we have a private sector in space, which means we're not totally behind. But clearly there's a lack of presidential will, and it's bipartisan. And some of the worst offenders here are conservative Republicans who don't want to spend money on things like putting people in space because they don't understand how important it is. China intends to grab the important nodes in space and to use it for, among other things, military purposes.
When John F. Kennedy said all of that, and one of my favorite lines, and I don't have the direct quote in front of me, so I'm going to mess it up, but he says, we choose these things not because they're easy, but because they are hard, and because they will take the best of what we have and make it possible. Okay. When he's there at Rice University and he lays this challenge out for America, we stepped up to the plate as Americans and were successful. What I don't think that maybe he did imagine it. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that most average Americans did not imagine the changes that we would become so dependent on in our lives because of that space travel. And we have satellite imagery on our phones and maps and the ability to move around the world. So sometimes the investments that we make wind up being as a country, are beneficial to future generations in ways we can't even imagine.
Yeah, and clearly, I mean, it was not only Tang that we got. Which people won't remember, but that used to be orange juice, dried orange juice in a bottle. I mean, that came from the space race, but also, as you say, your personal device. That really is a spin-off from the space race. So you got the phones, you got iPads, you got all sorts of things that Velcro.
Right.
I mean, it's just things that we take for granted. But yes, of course. And this is just the nature of innovation, that people discover something and they may not know how significant it is. Someone else comes along and says, hey, I can do this. And like the best example is like Post-its. Someone develops an adhesive which doesn't work. And somebody at 3M says, there's a really good use for adhesives that aren't very good. And so we get Post-its. And that just shows you that's the nature of innovation.
Right.
I mean, sometimes we realize the significance of what we develop, but oftentimes we don't. And oftentimes we don't for a very long period until something comes up that makes an invention long ago useful.
They create entirely new industries and new markets that we never even thought of before.
Yeah, and that's the nature of innovation. It's just sort of someone comes along with an idea which completely changes the way that we live. It's just, we always improve, and that is, it's stunning. But when you have 330 million people, you can actually, some of them actually do come up with some pretty good ideas every once in a while.
Yeah, they really do. Okay, so we've talked about innovation, we've talked about China, and we talked about how if you are the leader in innovation, you're going to wind up being a world leader. So we've got to make sure we're protecting America. What other topics would you like to cover before we close out the podcast? What do you think it's important for people to know?
I think that we are at a time where the world is changing faster than our ability to understand it, which means that some of our assumptions are probably obsolete. And as a result of that, we don't understand the danger. We're transitioning from a period of general calm to one of constant turbulence. We don't know what the consequences of that will be, but we have to consider that things which were unimaginable just last year are now possible and maybe even probable.
So I hope that as people listen to this podcast, they begin thinking about things in a different way. And I'm sure many people, given what the world and the country has gone through in the last 2.5 years with COVID, have begun to do that. And I hope this inspires them to do a little bit more, to research some of what you've talked about, and to remember that we do face unusual threats that maybe we didn't think we, as a country, we'd be facing 10, 20, 30 years ago, but we face them now. And one of the things we say in our documentary that we think is very important is that we've got to protect our patent system so that we can have innovation here in America, and it just winds up giving us an asset that we have in our country, and we need to protect it.
Develop the future.
That's great. Develop the future. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Gordon. I really appreciate it. And for everyone listening, again, this is Gordon Chang. He's in our documentary film, Innovation Race. You can find out more about the documentary at innovationracemovie.com. I'm Jenny Beth Martin with Tea Party Patriots Action and the executive producer of Innovation Race. Thanks for listening.
The Innovation Race podcast is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin and produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, Lori Heiselman, and Andy Peterson. Luke Livingston directs the video podcast. Innovation Race podcast is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org. That's teapartypatriots.org.